I have a long history of sort of entering into the field of psychotherapy integration and trying to frame how we might bring a little bit more order to the system. And of course, the pioneers laid that out. But I got hooked back into CEPI in becoming president. And then I've been working with Jeffrey Smith, who has sort of a general model of psychotherapy and is concerned with how do we get to the core issues of mechanism. And then, of course, the pioneer, Marv Goldfried, had been thinking about, hey, kind of what can we agree? Jeffrey and Marv and I last year had a series of conversations. And it was out of that set of conversations that we began to circle and develop this concept of the common core. The common core is similar to common factors, but it's actually more specified, both deeper and broader, at least the way we were thinking about it. The common core itself can be thought of as in relationship to a specification about the core problems that people bring or what psychotherapy addresses, which we frame in terms of maladaptive patterns of, I would call, mental behavior. That's my little technical process by which people are adjusting and adapting to their environment. And really entrenched maladaptive patterns are good ways to frame, if across a number of different possible mental systems, good ways to frame the thing. And then underneath that, well, what are the mechanisms that give rise to these entrenched maladaptive patterns? Neurobiological, learning, contextual mechanisms, large systems that would potentially contribute to setting up, facilitating bad mechanisms, and then what would also be the kinds of mechanisms that would reverse those kinds of processes. So the second layer is the underlying, sort of somewhat scientifically reductive look that would be underneath the processes that we could get a more basic understanding from sort of a traditional scientific viewpoint. And then from there kind of come up to a systems behavioral process view that thinks about, okay, when we place things in a dynamic active element, what are the unfoldings that give rise both to the problems on the one hand and to effective therapy? How do we understand the processes of change, say relative to the mechanisms of change? What facilitates the systemic unfolding? So we have problems, we have mechanisms, we have processes, and then finally, for us as what I call psychological doctors or healers, what are the fundamental principles that we need to bring to bear to hold psychotherapy, to approach it, to understand it, and fundamentally to facilitate its effective outcomes. So we have the common core consisting then of these core problems of entrenched maladaptive patterns, exploration of the underlying mechanisms, unfolding of processes, and the principles that we want to hold. And we think that elaborates some on the common factors kind of issue, but does so with a lot more potential depth, richness, and specificity. And so this becomes sort of, I see this sort of as the bullseye epicenter of the field. And then as we spoke, I have a metaphor or use the idea kind of sort of three layers of psychotherapy integration. So we have now, this is the epicenter. And then I see the single schools can be at least potentially thought of as mountains of ideas, these mountains of schools of thought or paradigms that are clusters of ideas of what these things are, what kind of entrenched maladaptive patterns, what are the underlying then mechanisms, what are the processes that us therapists and principles that therapists would have. So each school would have those. The field of psychotherapy integration, founded by Paul Wachtel and Marv Goldfried and all the pioneers, was then, okay, well, what kinds of systematic interrelations, what are the pathways between the mountains themselves that we might afford to see where the overlap was, to avoid unnecessary splitting, to see if we can actually create a systematic integrated view. And of course, then the pathways, technical eclecticism, et cetera, and all of the work that psychotherapy integration did. And the final layer that I'm actually interested in, I'm a big picture thinker, is whether or not you could actually get a coherent picture of the landscape of the schools, okay? So couldn't you see each of these mountains, and could you place them on a coherent range? And would you ever be able to find a meta perspective, meta theoretical perspective, philosophical perspective that would allow you to zoom out and essentially draw the circle around the entire landscape and place the mountains in proper relation? So at the very least, you could see what they were doing, the position in the landscape was what they were kind of addressing. This is called unified. And me and Andre Marquis and a bunch of other people within the unified psychotherapy integration sort of have been arguing for kind of a unified pathway, with the argument then is this most zoomed out view can achieve some degree of coherence, frame what has been a jungle in the landscape. And then this layering then, I think, potentially advances the field to pick up the ball from where psychotherapy integration was, and then to move it by identifying its fundamental center, seeing the schools of thought, build it off psychotherapy relation, and then framing it from a broad, unifying way. And I think if we do that, we go from a pretty chaotic, fragmented pluralism to a more coherent, integrated pluralism that addresses, I think, what fundamentally Marv Goldfried's concern is what can we agree, and can we really start a process of cumulative knowledge in our field?